When the police officers humiliated an elderly black man, they had no idea that he was the new mayor of the city. This incident sent shockwaves through the town, exposing painful truths about racism and injustice. What followed would astonish even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Mark Hopkins, an elderly black man, calmly stepped out of his house, looking forward to his first day in office. Today was his first day as the mayor of Greenville. He felt proud and confident. He had fought long and hard for justice, and now the people of the city had entrusted him with its leadership. His wife hugged him at the door, reminding him to be careful and return home earlier than usual. Despite his nerves, Mark decided to walk to City Hall. He loved the feeling of the streets and the people who had greeted him warmly during his campaign. He knew many of these people were counting on him to bring change and hoped for justice. As Mark crossed a busy intersection, two police officers approached him. Both looked irritated, their faces filled with fatigue and tension, as if their day had already started on a bad note. One of them, a large man with a short-cropped haircut, stared coldly at Mark, suspicion written all over his face. "Hey, you!" the officer shouted, rudely blocking Mark's path. "What are you doing here?" Mark froze, feeling an unpleasant sensation grow inside him. He took a deep breath and tried to respond calmly. "I'm on my way to work, sir," he said, but his words had no effect on the officer. The man's frown deepened. "Don't waste our time," snarled the second officer, a lean man with a hardened gaze. "This isn't a place for someone like you. Do you even know where you are?" The officers looked at him as if he were not a respected man, but someone they were used to ignoring or humiliating. One of them suddenly shoved Mark, pressing him against the wall of a nearby building. The cold wall hit his back, but Mark remained standing straight, knowing that any resistance could only make things worse. A crowd began to gather. Passers-by slowly stopped, watching the scene unfold with confusion. Some took out their phones, clearly ready to record the incident. Mark felt the situation spiraling out of control but stayed calm. "Are you sure you know who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice still firm and composed. The officers exchanged glances and laughed. "We don't care who you are," the first officer sneered. "You're nobody, just another one of those people walking in the wrong place." A heavy silence hung in the air. One of the officers yanked the badge off Mark's coat, not bothering to read the name on it. At that moment, a passerby, an older man with a serious expression, approached the officers and stared intently at Mark. The officers immediately tensed. "What's going on here?" the man asked calmly but firmly, recognizing Mark. "This guy says he's the mayor," one of the officers scoffed, his voice dripping with skepticism. "That's because he is the mayor," the man replied, staring them down. The officers froze. In that moment, their faces went pale as the realization hit them. Seconds stretched like an eternity, as if the whole world stood still, watching what would happen next. The officers, realizing their mistake, exchanged uneasy glances. The first one, who had shoved Mark, loosened his grip slightly, his confidence suddenly drained. The second officer, still clutching Mark's badge, nervously adjusted his gun belt, but said nothing. The crowd remained silent, with a few people starting to whisper amongst themselves. "Is this true?" The short-haired officer tried to maintain his tough demeanor, but uncertainty crept into his voice. He shot a sharp look at the man who had approached them. This man was none other than John Harrington, the local police chief, someone the officers knew, and who knew Mark personally. "It's true," Harrington confirmed, his gaze stern. "Mr. Hopkins is the new mayor of Greenville, and if you had bothered to check his identification, instead of acting on your prejudices, you would have known that." Harrington's words hung in the air, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The officers, shocked and overwhelmed by the gravity of what they had done, began to retreat. But the situation had already spiraled beyond their control. The crowd began murmuring louder, and someone shouted, "There they are, real racists! Act first, think later!" People continued recording, and this only added to the tension. Mark watched as the officers' faces grew paler with the realization of the scope of their error. "We didn't know," the second officer began to stammer, casting nervous glances between his colleagues and Mark. "It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Mark repeated calmly but firmly as he adjusted his coat, finally freeing his hands. The physical pressure was gone, but the sense of humiliation lingered. A misunderstanding is when you accidentally bump into someone in a crowd. But when you see a person and immediately decide they're a criminal just because they're black, that's called prejudice. The crowd murmured in approval, with some people shouting words of support for Mark. The officers tried to retreat, but Harrington wouldn't let them off the hook. "We need to discuss your actions," the police chief said, his tone growing harsher. "You've forgotten that you serve this city and its citizens. And right now, instead of protecting and serving, you're humiliating its mayor." Mark stared directly into the officer's eyes, feeling a wave of anger and disappointment wash over him. He thought about how often similar incidents happen to other black people who can't defend themselves as he could now. He remembered the stories of those who had suffered from bias and injustice at the hands of the system. And although this incident was personal, he knew it wasn't just about him. This moment could be the start of something bigger. "I'm not letting this go," Mark said, his voice steady but full of determination. "This isn't just an insult to me as mayor. It's an insult to every black resident of this city, and I intend to make sure incidents like this never happen again." The officers remained silent, understanding that any move they made now would only make things worse. The police chief nodded briefly, knowing that this situation had already escalated beyond a simple disciplinary matter. "We'll be conducting an investigation immediately," Harrington announced. "I'll make sure that everyone involved in this incident is held accountable. This includes both of you." The crowd began to disperse, but the tension still hung in the air. Mark lifted his head and made eye contact with someone recording the event. He knew this incident had already gone viral online, and within hours, the news would spread across the city. But this was just the first step. Mark was ready to use this situation to reform a system that had oppressed him and others like him for years. As Mark finally continued on his way to City Hall, his mind was already filled with plans to reform the police force. Videos recorded by onlookers began to gain traction on social media within an hour of the incident. Headlines on news sites blared, "Police officers humiliate black man, unaware he's the new mayor." The online community quickly reacted to the footage, with people voicing their outrage over the police's bias and racism. Comments flooded social media, with some calling for the immediate dismissal of the officers involved, while others used this incident as a springboard to raise issues of systemic discrimination. By evening, local news channels had picked up the story. The city's administration couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Journalists surrounded City Hall, demanding comments from Mark. The press office was forced to arrange an emergency briefing, although Mark himself was still contemplating how to best leverage this moment for meaningful change. Meanwhile, protests began to spring up across the city. Activist groups, galvanized by what had happened, took to the streets with signs decrying police misconduct. "Justice for Mark Hopkins," read the banners held by demonstrators gathered outside the police department and City Hall. These rallies grew larger by the hour, with participants demanding police reform and a thorough investigation into the incident. Watching the events unfold from his office, Mark realized that the situation had transcended a mere misunderstanding. It had become a symbol of a deeply rooted problem. As he glanced at his phone, where notifications of new media mentions and social media posts came in non-stop, he understood that his role as mayor wasn't just to ignite this fire, but to guide it in the right direction. The following morning, Mark arranged a private meeting with John Harrington, the police chief. Harrington was visibly tense, clearly concerned about his reputation and the future of his department. He immediately suggested launching an internal investigation and suspending the officers involved. But Mark was aiming for something bigger. "John," Mark began, "I understand that suspensions are a step in the right direction, but that won't solve the problem at its core. We need to show everyone that this city won't tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. This isn't just an isolated incident. We need to change the entire culture within the police department." Harrington paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. "You're asking for a full-scale reform?" he asked, rubbing his chin. "Exactly," Mark replied confidently. "We need to train officers to respond properly in these situations, run bias awareness programs, and implement community policing initiatives. I don't just want to punish those responsible, I want to prevent this from ever happening again." The discussion was long and difficult. Harrington understood that Mark was serious, and resisting would be futile. In the end, they reached an agreement. A comprehensive reform of the local police force would be launched. The process would take time, but Mark knew that public support would be on his side. Meanwhile, social media continued to buzz with activity. People posted using hashtags like Justice for Mayor, #Police Reform, demanding change. Journalists interviewed locals who expressed their opinions about what had happened. A sense of anticipation began to form around the city. Everyone knew that change was coming. That evening, Mark made an official statement to the local press. Standing on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by microphones and cameras, he addressed the citizens of Greenville. "What happened yesterday is not just an isolated incident," he began, his voice clear and steady. "It's a manifestation of a deeper problem that we've been facing for decades. But this city can be an example for others if we fight injustice not just with words, but with action." His speech was short but powerful. It quickly went viral online, and by the next day, the entire country was discussing Mark's new push for police reform. In the days following the street incident, as tensions slowly began to ease, the real work of systemic change began. The police officers involved in the incident with Mark were temporarily suspended, and the city administration launched an official investigation into their actions. But for Mark, this was only the beginning. He understood that the widespread attention and support gave him the opportunity to enact real changes the city had long needed. The first step was organizing a meeting with community leaders, human rights advocates, and representatives from police unions. At this meeting, Mark presented his reform plan. He proposed creating an independent civilian oversight board that would review complaints against the police and monitor internal discipline within the department. He also suggested mandatory bias training for police officers, aimed at fostering trust and cooperation with the community. "We need to work together," Mark said at the meeting, addressing everyone present. "Police reform is impossible without the active participation of citizens and without the involvement of the police themselves. Only then can we create a city where people feel safe and trust those who are supposed to protect them." These proposals sparked intense discussions. Initially, the police unions were skeptical, but under public pressure and with media support, they began to realize that resisting the changes would only worsen the situation. The press continued to cover every step Mark took, and his proposals garnered support not only from activists, but also from ordinary citizens who were tired of feeling like the system was stacked against them. Mark knew the road ahead would be long. He worked 12-hour days, organizing roundtable discussions, inviting experts and consultants, and drafting detailed plans for changes in police practices. He wanted these reforms to serve as a model for other cities, so that Greenville could become an example for the entire country. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the incident were coming to terms with the consequences of their actions. One of them, the senior officer with the short haircut who had been the most aggressive, tried to defend himself by saying he couldn't have known who he was dealing with. But that didn't save him from a wave of criticism and an internal investigation. The second officer, younger and less experienced, realized that his actions were a result of a system that had shaped his biases, and he began to reassess his views. He was forced to confront his own prejudices and understand that his behavior had been wrong. At a public forum where the new police reforms were being discussed, this younger officer stood up and addressed Mark and the crowd. "I realize now that I was wrong. The way we treated you, Mayor Hopkins, and the way we often treat others in this city is a result of a system that needs to change. I want to apologize, not just to you, but to all the citizens I may have wronged with my actions." This moment became a key turning point in the process of change. People saw that even those within the system could change and take responsibility for their actions. Mark listened carefully and nodded. "Recognizing your mistakes is the first step toward healing," he said. "But we have a lot of work ahead. It's not enough to simply acknowledge the problem. We must do everything we can to fix it." The following weeks were busy. The first police training sessions began, involving both officers and community members. A new support center for victims of police misconduct was opened, and the Civilian Oversight Board started its work. The media continued to cover every step of the reforms, while social media kept rallying support for Mark. In the end, this incident became a launching point for wide-ranging changes not only in Greenville but beyond. Other cities began to adopt Mark Hopkins' approach, and Mark himself became a national leader in the movement for police reform. Greenville was no longer known only as a city with a history of racial prejudice, but as an example of how injustice can be fought when people come together. One evening, looking out the window of his office at City Hall, Mark felt a sense of satisfaction. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but that first step had given him the confidence that change was possible.